Good morning. Today we are going to be working with realism. This is a period in literature from the late 19th century. It goes from around 1860 to 1914. In part, it meant a reaction against Romanticism and the idealization of reality. While the Romantics sought to transcend the immediate to find the ideal, the realists focused on the immediate, the here and now, the specific action, what they could actually see or hear. Realists supported a mimetic theory of art, and they centered their attention in the thing imitated, looking for one-to-one correspondence between the representation and the subject. In the same way that we saw that in Romanticism the genre that flourished the most was poetry, we can say that realism centered in the novel. It had its origins in France with Balzac, in England with George Eliot, and in America with Mark Twain. Howard Dean Howells defined realism as nothing more and nothing less than the truthful treatment of the material. For Howells, fiction had to stop lying. He said that writers should speak the dialect, the language of unaffected people everywhere. The realist writer emphasized detachment, objectivity, accurate observation, lucid but restrained criticism of social environment and mores. He attempted to portray the lives, appearances, problems, customs of the common people, so he reproduced attitudes, material conditions, and the physical setting of the people around them. In order to understand realism, a comparison with Romanticism would come useful. As we studied in the previous classes, Romanticism dwelt on personal passions on the subject side of experience. On the other hand, the realists were concerned with the tangible world outside their psychics. Writers felt they could no longer fantasize or imagine what the Romantics had done. All that soul-reaching living in a cabin in the middle of nowhere has come to an end. They projected the very facts that Romantics ignore or push to the background. They wanted to write about what was real. That's why they focused on life as it was, rather than as it might be. They wanted to show things as they were, to give a detailed portrayal of life. And as they wanted to be scientific, they portrayed facts. Romantics made use of exotic settings, and nature appeared very often idealized in their works. If you remember some of the poems learned, you will definitely remember that they were set in an idealized environment. There were other poets that went back to the Middle Ages looking for exotic settings. Contrary to this, realist writers were interested in developing setting to recreate specific time in place and to see the place and to set the person in that real place. So settings are ordinary, the characters are ordinary, and they are not concerned with absolute or ideals as the Romantics were. They want to deal with the social problems of real people in real places at present time. So, to summarize, realists were concerned with the tangible world outside their psychics, whereas the Romantics were concerned with their subjective responses. Realists dealt with social problems of real people in real places, while Romantics were concerned with absolutes or ideals of the past. The realists then want to focus on life as it is, rather than as it might be. What they are interested in doing is to give a faithful portrayal of reality as if it were a photograph. So, which are the criteria of the realist mode? In the first place, they are for verisimilitude of detail, which is derived from observation and documentation. That brought about very long novels in which there were long descriptions of the setting and of characters, the way they dress, the way they talk, the gestures, etc. There was an effort to approach the norm of experience, a reliance upon the representative rather than the exceptional in plot, setting, and character. So, in a few words, the norm was the ordinary. There was an objective view of human nature and experience. Now, how was that reflected in the literary texts of the time? The novel rests on the strength of its character rather than on plot. It was more important the development of characters and the characterization than what actually happened in the novel. As they were for an objective representation of reality, they chose a third-person omniscient narrator. So they were not part of the story, but they could tell it from the point of view of a witness or of an observer. There were plenty of details about the characters and setting. And as I said before, characters and settings were ordinary. For the first time, characters were given a name and surname like real people have, and settings generally corresponded to places that you could find in a map, that is to say that they really existed. They valued the individual highly. Consequently, as I said before, characterization was at the center of the novel. And they wrote about the plight of the individual facing hardship or moral dilemma. Most of the time, the subject matter was a complex ethical choice. There was a character that had to make a choice that very often involved a moral dilemma. Who are the main representatives? In the United States, we can talk about Henry James, Edith Wharton, Howard Dean Howells, Mark Twain, Stephen Crane, even though he's also representative of naturalism. And in England, we can refer to Charles Dickens and George Eliot. Whenever we think of realism, we also have to consider psychological realism, which was a sort of genre within realism that focused on the motivations and internal thoughts of characters. Writers wanted to express what the characters did, but also why they did or why they took such actions. Somehow, psychological realism paved the way to the stream of consciousness style, which would become prominent during modernism. The main representative of psychological realism was Henry James. In the United States, regionalism and local color developed, and because of the intense curiosity of readers to learn about other sections of their country, many American writers specialized in describing places, events, manners, and even the speech of specific regions and locales. The main representatives were Sarah Orne Jewett, Mark Twain, William Dean Howells, and Henry James. What do I mean by that? For example, if you happen to have read The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, you will see that Huck speaks the language of an educated boy, someone who has not been sent to school. So he would use ungrammatical structures. You also have the character of Jim, who's a black slave, and he uses black English. There were other things, not only reproducing exactly the way the people spoke in those places, but also the folklore of those places. For example, the same novel I was mentioning before, there are many references to superstitions that were held to be true at the time the novel was written. Well, I hope this is clear enough. If you have any doubts, please do not hesitate to ask in the forum for this unit.